Okay, good afternoon or good morning to everyone. I'm Debbie Melnick, and this is the VCSQI's sort of last-minute webinar on meeting the quality improvement milestones. Previously, this was scheduled as an opioid management work group. And Ivan and Sherry and I were talking about how the practices are moving through the milestones that are part of the TCPI effort. And we recognized that some of the fundamental milestones related to quality improvement were still tripping up some practices. So we thought this kind of webinar might be helpful for everyone as either a refresher or perhaps new information that you want to eventually share with your staff. This is being recorded, so you can have your staff listen to it at another time if you like. Hopefully you've received the documents I sent this morning, the PowerPoint file, and several other documents that we'll be referring to. So what are these milestones? Well, they're numbered differently depending on whether you're specialty or primary care. They're numbered differently on the assessment tool. So 14, 15, and 16 are on the specialty tool. 19, 20, and 21 are the numbers for these milestones if you are primary care. What we'd like to do today then is to review the scoring for these three milestones and outline strategies for meeting each of them. Then we'll just review the relevance of these three milestone scores to the phases. As you may recall, or yet to hear more about if you're new, there are 5 phases of transformation that the milestones relate to. And these are the phases that we're working together to move you through. At the end of phase 5, your practice is presumably ready to participate in an alternative payment model. So this call might go longer than 30 minutes, but we'll proceed as expeditiously as we can and hopefully have time for some discussion. So first of all, what's the goal and how do you get there? This might be how we all feel at the end of any given day, but as it relates to TCPI, you may recall there are 7 aims to this national project, 3 of which are very focused on results and quality and improvement. One that looks at whether patient results, patient outcomes have improved. Another is focused on reducing unnecessary tests or procedures. And a third relates to reducing unnecessary hospitalizations or ER visits. Addressing these 3 aims requires measurement in all cases of what you're currently doing or a practice is currently doing, and then improvement. So 3 milestones address quality improvement. And we know that there are, that for each of you and your practice and your clinicians, providing the best care you can is definitely a goal, whether it's part of TCPI or the work you do every day. So hopefully the presentation and the strategies we're going to offer to you today will be valuable to you, not just for this project, but for what you do on a daily basis. So let's take a look at milestone 14 or 19 on primary care first. It reads that a practice uses an organized approach to identify and act on improvement opportunities. What is an organized approach? I'm going to turn the slides over to Ivan Burkle now, who I hope all of you have had a chance to speak with. Ivan?
All right, thank you, Debbie. So for this milestone 14, I've noticed that many practices score themselves low, a 0 or a 1 to start when they complete the baseline assessment. And I think it's that word organized that throws them off. And I think a lot of practices are thinking, do we send people out for training or do we bring in consultants to do formal training, things like that. The essence of what this milestone is asking is, do we have a systematic way for how we go about problem solving or identifying issues and problem solving? And when we say organized approach, the essence of what the milestone is getting at is, do we have a common structure and a common language for how we're going to do this. And so the models given in the milestone, for example, PDSA, which stands for Plan, Do, Study, Act, or the model for improvement, Lean, FMEA, Six Sigma, those are all standardized approaches that have been used in other industries, have been used somewhat in healthcare, and lots of times there are training courses around those models that hospitals and practices start to use and incorporate. So let's talk to the scores and how I would interpret them for the practice. A score of a 0 indicates that the practice has not incorporated a standard improvement methodology as yet. It would also indicate that maybe we're not quite sure what these are or how we would even start to use them in the practice. A score of a 1 would indicate that the practice has at least started to look at these things, understand some of the differences between them, and has decided on a standard QI methodology and knows that this is something that they would like to use. For example, a lot of practices, even practices I've managed in the past, use Plan, Do, Study, Act, just because it's consistent with how a lot of us think and problem solve already. I have another practice that comes to mind, Hopedale Cardiology in Boston. It's 2 physicians who lead the group. They were recently exposed to lean methodologies and training. They've gone as far as to buy books that they would like the staff to read and are beginning to talk about what are we going to learn from these books and how are we going to implement that in the practice. Those are just 2 examples. A score of a 2 would indicate that we've decided on a methodology and we're starting to execute some ideas in the practice and starting to orient our staff in this new methodology, essentially so that we're all getting on the same page and speaking the same language. And a score of a 3 would indicate that the practice fully has incorporated this methodology into practice, and we are habitually executing change ideas in the practice setting. And a score of a 3 would indicate that the practice is in the habit of continuous improvement. We see something, we have a way of fixing it, we're all on the same page for how we do it, and that should be what all practices are working toward. So let's take a look at some examples on the pages to come, on the slides to come.
Okay, I'm trying to advance this and it's not going for me. There we go.
That's okay. So the first example I referenced is PDSA, which stands for Plan, Do, Study, Act. And the model on the screen illustrates that it is a continuous process. And this is something that many practices do already, just in terms of how we identify problems and how we problem solve. The act of formalizing it means that we orient staff to the process, that we are on the same page in terms of the language that we use, and we have the ability to document our improvements or successes as we make them. Now, is it important to document every small improvement that we make? Not necessarily, but if we are to share our ideas with others, if we were, for example, to join an alternative payment model and belong to a larger group, we may be asked to share some ideas for things we've put in place that worked well for our practice, and just being in the habit of documenting our PDSA cycles of improvement is a good way to share those best practices with others. So PDSA stands for Plan, Do, Study, Act, if we start with the upper quadrant on the right. And that's essentially, once we identify an issue or know that there's something that needs to be fixed or put in place, what's our plan? Are we talking about it as a practice? What are we going to do? Who needs to be involved? When does it need to happen? And where is it going to take place? After we develop that plan, we naturally put that plan in place. We start to do the thing that we said that we were going to do. And after we've done that for maybe just a few days or maybe a few weeks, we start to study, or we see what was the outcome of this new plan we put in place. Is it working? Is it not working? Is the thing we thought was going to happen, is it happening, or is it not? And if it is, how are we going to act? Are we going to keep that in place, or are we going to change it and come up with a new plan to continue that cycle of improvement? And so just understanding PDSA, using the same language amongst our staff, especially when we have those problems that affect the whole clinic, those up front and those in the back. It becomes more important for all of us to use the same language and the same context for problem solving. If you go to the next slide, lots of times, again, PDSA happens all the time, right? We notice there's a problem perhaps with the check-in process, and we automatically go into problem solving mode, put a new process in place, implement it, and see how that works. But as I said earlier, there is our worksheets involved with PDSA, so we can document the work that we do. One, so we can perhaps share it with other practices as an example of a good process that works. Two, so that we can have a history of the work that we've done, document it, and it may change in time, so it's good to have documentation of the plans that we've put in place. And three, another good reason to document PDSA cycles is because turnover in practices can sometimes be high. And so we have the documentation to share with staff what happened, how did we get here, what's the plan that we have in place, and a step-by-step process for how staff should do things moving forward. You'll see at the box in the top, the grid, on the right side under title and change, there's a cycle. That's there because oftentimes when we put new processes in place, they may change several times over the course of a year or over the course of many years. And that cycle just indicates a place to say, okay, maybe this is not the first time we've done this. Maybe it's the third, fourth, or fifth time we've done this. And so documenting these things help us, one, to keep a record of the fact that work was done, but helps us to understand the nuances perhaps of what changed from cycle to cycle. And again, this becomes really important if staff changes and we're trying to backtrack, how did we get to here, or how did this change get in place? So PDSA is what I like to call the wheel of all performance improvement. It is it's something that I've used in practices I've worked with and consulted for, and practices I've managed in the past, just to make sure we are documenting all of the small changes that we make in the practice. And PDSA, I think, is something that's easy for almost every practice to adopt, share with staff quickly, and engage them in making small cycles of improvement. The next tool I'm going to show you.
Ivan, if I can just say, both this worksheet that's still on the screen and the next one are two of the documents I sent in the email earlier today. Okay.
A second tool that I use widely in practices is from the Lean, L-E-A-N. And Lean does not mean, to thin down or to make lean. That's just the name of the methodology adopted from the Toyota manufacturing process. But a tool that we use from that school of thought is called standard work. And the next three slides include a blank template, a comical example that I will talk through with you, and then a real world example from a practice that was working, that we worked with on this process during phase 2 of this project. The purpose of Lean standard work is to have is first and foremost to get staff on the same page for exactly how we're going to do something. lots of times in the practices, we have one way of thinking up front and we have one way of thinking in the back. And it's important that when there's a problem for staff to come together and sit down, complete this worksheet so that we're on the same page for exactly how things should be done, the order in which things should be done, what are the key steps in order to do this thing successfully, and why this is important. And so from top to bottom and left to right, this sheet, it'll give you a chance to indicate the operation that's being looked at, who owns it, and the date that it's being done. We sometimes use a picture or a drawing just to illustrate the process and for training purposes. We include the step number, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, et cetera, and if necessary, the amount of time it should take to do each step. After that, we look in the middle at the major step. What is the key thing that must be done? And then to the right of that, the key point, what exactly, how is this to be done? What needs to be considered? What do we need to keep in mind, et cetera? And then last on the right, the reason. And lots of times what I found in practices is that when things aren't being done the right way, the steps are clear. There's typically a policy that outlines the steps, but the how, the key point, and the why, the reason, those are usually the parts where staff is not quite sure, and that's why things are not being done the right way. So on the next slide, we are going to look at an example that I made for my 3 children at home. The work template hangs in all 4 bathrooms in the house. I have 3 small children, 11, 10, and 8, girl, boy, boy, and they share bathrooms. And so this is something that we made for our household just to set some expectations and get everyone on the same page. And so you'll see we gave it a date, the date on which we first created this, and we call this using the toilet. And so step 1 is to, get ready to sit or stand. If you're going to sit, make sure that the seat is down. That's really important for my daughter and for my boys too. It's important to pull your pants down all the way to avoid making a mess on the floor. And if you're going to stand, we see what the instructions are there. You see that where understand, I put the words, lift seat, hold, aim, and look directly where you are aiming. I realized I needed to italicize and underline the word look because I have small boys, and it became clear to me that they were looking elsewhere while they were doing their business. And so we can emphasize things like that in this document, and the why. I won't read through it, but it explains that cleanliness is important, and we want to minimize the potential of a mess. Step 2 is self-explanatory. Use the toilet and make sure that you're done. Step 3 is to wipe, and the how. It explains, the number of the toilet squares that we should use. That's more from my perspective, making sure we're not taking too much, clogging the toilet, and doing things like that. And there's also a further explanation in the why. Step 4, we ask them to make sure that you flush the toilet, close the lid and flush, and we emphasize how that should be done and why it's important. Because I have 2 small boys again, we ask them to double check and make sure that it's flushed again. And if there's any issue, we want you to make sure and call mom and dad before we leave the bathroom so that nobody has any surprises in the future. And step 6 is the only one for which we indicated a time. We want you to make sure that you take 30 seconds with warm water and wash your hands, make sure they're clean, and turn off the lights. So you'll see from, just this example, and this took me about an hour and a half to put on paper just to get all the thoughts down, to summarize it, to present it in an easy to read, easy to understand way, but it does outline the steps everyone should follow, and it makes it easy for me as a parent to hold them accountable for the things that they don't do and have them go back and read step 4 and step 5 again, which is often the case with the boys. And this has probably changed since the first time it was created on January 2nd of 2018. We've had about 4 or 5 iterations since, but again, this is something that we use at home, and I've used it quite successfully in practices. Again, it's because we're often trying to get on the same page for how we're going to do something, how we're going to schedule, how we're going to check in patients, how we're going to bring them back, how we're going to deal with callbacks, things like that, how we're going to check them out. So this is important and a good way to get staff engaged and help develop the process for how we're going to do something. The next example that I'm going to share was from a primary care practice that we work with in Maryland. That practice was, you can see the date on the top, October 26th, that was of last year, 2017. The practice just was trying to document a process for how they're going to work with behavioral health providers in the outpatient setting. And so we call this outpatient behavioral health communication standard work. We determined it was a 4-step process between the provider and the behavioral health, the other 2 behavioral health providers that they worked with. And so you'll see we didn't, 4 steps, we didn't include any times for how long each step should take, but the major steps outlined what the process should be in terms of how we refer the patients and how that communication comes back to the primary care. The key points indicate what is going to be done in terms of what are we going to give the patient, when are we going to call, who are we going to call, and why is that important. This was helpful for one, helping the practice just get on the same page for how they're going to do this and what they can expect of each other. And it was also helpful for this practice to share this with their behavioral health providers to let them know this is going to be our new process internally. This is what we're asking of you. If for some reason you cannot do step 3 or 4 the way that we're asking, please, let us know and we will modify this accordingly. So it helps the practice, one, get on the same page for how we're going to do something. If you work closely with other practices, you can engage them in this process to help develop a standard process that everyone helps to create. And so we assume everyone will buy in and commit to the process. And again, it just creates a good way to problem solve and document what the solution to our problem solving is going to be. Are there any additional thoughts, comments, or questions before I move on?
Ivan, I love both examples. The comical one does still make the point of how, stating steps and how and reasons clearly can help, in that case, your children understand what is expected of them. And this as a real world example, of course, is helpful. But how does this get made? Who does this?
So these are typically made, if you go to the next slide, the short answer is staff. Staff should be involved in developing the standard work. And you include the physicians at a certain point in time, the office managers at a certain point in time. But I believe that if people are fully engaged in the identification of a solution or problem solving, they will commit to it much more rapidly, and they will be engaged in the continuous cycles of improvement for that process. And this ties right into milestone 15 or milestone 20 for primary care practices. And milestone 15 asks the extent to which practice builds quality improvement capabilities in the practice and empower staff to innovate and improve. So for this one, many practices also score themselves at a 0 or a 1 to start. A score of a 1 would indicate that a limited number of practice staff or physicians have the QI skills and are involved in quality improvement initiatives. A score of a 2 would indicate that the practice is building quality improvement capabilities within the practice through approaches such as the ones that we've talked about, and ensures that staff is being exposed to training if available. And the score of a 3 would indicate that the practice has fully developed quality improvement capabilities and that staff is empowered to participate in quality improvement activities, and it's a part of their job duties and what they do, and they are recognized for it. And so when in our practices we identify issues or we hear practices, we hear issues that we know need to be solved, lots of times it's easy for the physician or the manager to take this on themselves, and I'm guilty of this as well, to say, I'll do it. I'll fix the problem, and when I fix it, I will give you guys a new policy or a process that I want you to follow. But what I find is that the solution is more likely to work, more likely to be sustained if staff is at the table and they have a say in developing the solution. And so that's something that for this project, TCPI, we should all be working toward a 3, where we are actively training our staff on these basic tools, PDSA, lean standard work, which don't take a lot of time. I think a lot of the training for those tools comes with practice actually, and then engaging them to do this, to lead these efforts, to participate, and to help other staff as they come on board to learn these new processes as well. So if we jump to the next slide, how do we do this? One, we provide basic information and education to staff. One way to do that is we could just share, for example, the webinar that's being recorded today. That would give staff enough exposure to PDSA and lean standard work where they could start to develop competencies in these tools. And as they listen to them, they will probably have ideas for things that they have recently put in place, things that need to be put in place that they're working on, or things that could be put in place just based on the issues that practice is having. There's also a webinar that VCSQI recorded in late 2017 that presents a very good overview of quality improvement principles as well, and we'll make sure that we share that with you after this call. Another way that we empower staff is just to ask what problems they are observing. When I used to manage a pediatric surgery practice and pediatric orthopedic surgery practice in Tampa, Florida, I had a whiteboard up on my office wall, a white sheet up on my office wall, and I asked every staff member before they left every day to put 2 Post-it notes on that sheet. We called it a plus delta sheet. And it was one thing that worked well in the practice, put that on the plus side for that day, and one thing that they thought could be tweaked or changed. And I asked them to do that every day before they left, and then every morning when they came in at 7 o'clock in the morning, we pulled 1 plus, 1 delta off of it, and we talked about that as a group and started to make plans for how we could start to correct that delta. So that's one of the ways we got them engaged in just observing and problem solving on a day-to-day basis. Point number 3, my staff would often wonder why I would spend 30 minutes to an hour just, I'd sit in the lobby every single day. And at first they thought I would watch them, observe them, but I was really just observing the patients, understanding I would watch patients and see how often they check their watches. I would see who would get up and leave before they even got called back to see the doctor. I would just keep an open ear and an open eye for what was upsetting our patients or what I perceived was upsetting our patients. And we would go into problem solving mode. What happened? Why do we think that happened? Why did they have to wait so long? Why did we ask them to show up so early? And we would come up with ideas and ask staff to come up with ideas for how we could fix that. Point number 4, listen to staff, especially after hours and they're just talking casually when they're in the break room. Listen for the things they complain about the most. It could be getting patients back. Why is this doctor coming and taking patients out of order? As staff talks to each other, I would listen closely for the words, we should, we should do this, or we should stop doing this, or things like that indicate, okay, there's an improvement opportunity that maybe we could engage staff and do a PDSA around, or maybe we would hear something that would indicate we are not on the same page. And that may be a good opportunity to pull somebody from the front, somebody from the back together and say, guys, I've noticed that we need to work on this process. Let's create standard work, at least begin to draft, a standard worksheet for how we're going to fix this, and maybe bring that to the next staff meeting and start to share it. One thing that's not on this slide that comes to mind as I talk through it, the other thing I would pay attention to with staff is what I call the long I. And what I mean by that is if we were talking about an issue or a problem, and I would hear staff say, well, I thought this, and well, hold on a minute, I thought that. That to me was an instant cue that, okay, we're not on the same page for how we think something should be done. And so let's sit down and start to talk about this, get your perspective, and let's start to document what should the process be that works for all of us. Next to last, and when you identify those issues, when you hear the long I, when you hear the we shoulds, as I said before, as a manager, as a clinician, as a nurse, it's natural for us to go into problem-solving mode, but it's important to engage staff and let them be part of the solutions that we develop as well. And again, a good way to especially get the front of the house and the back of the house to start to work together is to have them sit down and start to document a standard work form that just again indicates what needs to be done, how it should be done, and the reasons why. And that's a good way to get perspectives from multiple people. And once you do that, you engage staff, you're in this habit of problem solving, that's when you are ready to score yourself a 3 on milestone number 15. Now, in addition to those issues that come up, if you go to the next slide, the things that we hear, the things that we observe in the practice, there's also problem solving when, for example, we notice that we're not meeting the goals that we think we should or could meet. And milestone 16 asks the extent to which the practice produces and shares reports on performance at both the organization and the provider or the care team level, including progress over time and how performance compares to goals. It asks whether the practice has a system in place to assure follow-up action where appropriate. And so if you're doing, what we talked about in milestone 15 and 16, you will have a system in place to follow up where appropriate. But you may identify, opportunities, improvement opportunities, quality improvement opportunities, just from looking at your data and seeing how you're performing on certain quality measures over time. And so when we look at this milestone, a score of 0 indicates that the practice does not currently produce reports on how we're performing with certain quality or operational metrics. A score of a 1 would indicate that the practice produces some reports at the provider or the care team level, but the reports aren't fully shared with the staff. So somebody is looking at them, maybe thinking about them, but we're not sharing them with the frontline staff who, may be the right ones to help problem solve with that. A score of a 2 would indicate that the practice is regularly producing reports on how providers or care teams are performing and meeting quality goals, but the distribution of the reports is limited or there is inconsistent follow-up. So for many practices involved in TCPI, this project right now, they are regularly producing reports or quality data quarterly, because that's how we ask practices to submit that. But a score of a 3 would indicate that we are regularly producing these reports at either the quarterly, the monthly, the weekly level, and we're sharing them with our staff, and we have a system for if we notice an opportunity to improve, we are doing that. We're engaging staff in following up. And so next, I'm going to ask my colleague Sherry to talk about, how we can do a better job of making the data that we collect transparent, and how we can share that better with staff in a way that is visual, in a way that generates ongoing quality improvement work.
Very much, Ivy. And Debbie, if you can advance to the next slide, please.
Uh-huh.
By the way, for adding that very nice picture of me. For this specific milestone, I like to break it down into 3 distinct parts. The first is producing and sharing reports, then showing progress, and the last, acting on the data where needed. In the next slide, I'll briefly review each of the 3 sections. So now we're going to focus on producing reports, and Debbie, if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, before you can produce any report, it's imperative that you know what you're reporting on and your data collection resources. For example, in this process, this was done in your first meeting with either Ivan, Debbie, or I, where we met with you to select measures, identify your collecting methods, either it was EMR or your claims or other type of data collection method you may already have in place. And then we took that information to aggregate the data that we use later for analysis. So if you can go to the next slide, Debbie. All right, you may recall the data submission tool pictured here that was used to submit your quarterly data. This is an excellent example of a simple tool that can be used to help you prepare your data in a more transparent way as it relates to preparing or populating visual reports. By plugging in the numerator and the denominators for the specific form, it produced percentages that we will use to create additional charts. So Debbie, if you can advance, please. Okay, so here is just a more focused view of the selected measures and those populated percentages. These percentages can, or this data seen here, can then be populated into Word or Excel using the charting functions that they may have. Next slide, please. This is the product of that data as it was implemented or entered into Word, Excel, or PowerPoint. Included in the email that was sent earlier today, there were various tools to help you with communicating performance. In it, you will find the charting template tool with instructions on how to populate the template to your specific performance report. Please note that Debbie, Ivan, and I are readily available to help you along the way throughout the entire transition. Okay, next slide, please, Ms. Debbie. Okay, now for sharing that information. There are various methods for producing and sharing reports for each practice. For larger practices, it may be large town halls. For smaller practices, it may be a quick team meeting. However, by printing out the charts and discussing it in a team meeting, posting it on a break room wall, or creating a display board helps to prompt
Sherry,
action.
are you still there? Or is it me that can't hear?
I'm still here. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you, Sherry.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear it just
I
fine.
can hear you.
Okay, okay. I don't know where I left off. So by creating display boards, for example, can help prompt action in a few ways to share performance scores in no time at all, as well as evoke thought within your team and promote greater improvement for overall quality care. Next slide, please, Ms. Debbie. Now that you have your baseline data, let your team and employees know how you're doing. Simply update the graph to show the scores over time. This will involve going back to your original chart and simply adding new scores over time. Here's an example of the data captured over various quarters. You have your data now. CMS asks that you analyze it and make improvement along the way. going back to your chart, review it. You'll be amazed by how a simple chart can help prompt so many ideas and energy from your team. In this slide, you can see clearly some areas that are low and where improvement plans are needed. For example, documentation of current medications are low. This could prompt interventions such as adding additional training for your MAs, your nurses, or including checklists in the check-in process or patient care process. Other procedures may help ensure that this is done properly. Therefore, invoking the PDSA model that Ivan spoke of earlier, that continuously observe processes to make sure adjustments in order to meet the goals are made. As a reminder, our team here at VCSQI are here to help analyze your performance and help to improve your practice performance over time, wherever there's a need. Okay. This is a great way to become more transparent, which is using the Slate Boards. This is a fascinating way to rally your practice around goals and prompt thinking and planning across multiple disciplines. This offers different perspectives to solving problems and increase performances. Many practices have worked in a way that have worked with so many extraordinary members of the team who are dedicated, devoted, and just want to help but don't know how. So this milestone is a great way, and is one of my favorite milestones because it is inclusive and offers a greater sense of value to all members of the team as to what they can do to contribute to the success of the practice while using a fun and creative way to approach the situation. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Debbie, who's going to communicate the 5 phases and how each milestone applies.
Thank you, Sherry. So for those of you who have been enrolled for a while, you'll recall that Ivan walked you through the 5 phases of TCPI transformation. And those of you who are just started, you'll be seeing more about this. But these are coming from the national project level. The 5 phases, each focused on a specific area or a type of activity, from setting aims, which is phase 1, milestone number 13 on the specialty practice tool, where you set an aim that says, this is what we're going to do by this date. For example, we're going to increase the rate of measuring body mass index by 30% by January of 2018. Setting your aim gets you out of phase 1. Presumably, by the time you've accomplished a score of 3 on all milestones, you have completed phase 5, and your practice is ready to pursue joining an alternative payment model, should you choose to do that. So on the next slide, you see, again, a little bit more detail about the roadmap. This document, including the previous chart and this material, was also in a document in the email I sent to you all earlier today. So this is what you and Ivan have probably been looking at to understand the major activities associated with each phase. So on the next slide, I just did some cut and paste of graphs or tables, I guess, from the transformation work plan that each of you have or will have generated for you based on your baseline milestone scores. In this case, you see, and I've pointed to where the 3 quality-related milestones are. To complete phase 2, besides the scores on the other milestones, you need a 2 for milestone 14 and a 2 for milestone 15, and actually a 3 for milestone 16. The arrow does not point down there. So that means you need to have decided on a quality improvement model that you are beginning to incorporate into your regular activities. Your staff is building QI capability and using their skills to begin to participate in quality improvement activities That's 14 and 15, or 19 and 20 on the primary care assessment tool. But you also need to have accomplished a score of 3 already for the milestone that focuses on all of the reporting Sherry just reviewed. And that's because you need to be sharing, and you need to be collecting and analyzing and reporting and sharing data before you can accomplish a score of 3 for 14 and 15, which is where your staff actually are totally empowered and enmeshed in quality improvement activities. Milestone 15, score of 3 to get out of phase 3. And then at 14 or 19 on primary care, you have fully incorporated regular improvement methodology to execute change ideas in the practice setting. So in that case, you need a 3 for that milestone to complete phase 4. And as you can see, all the other milestone numbers, these are the specialty practice tool numbers, are addressed here as well. So that really concludes what we wanted to present to you today. We knew this would go a little more than 30 minutes. We're open to discussion, questions, comments, anything any of you would like to bring up. You can do it in the chat box, or just unmute yourself if you're muted and speak up. Ivan, is there anything you would like to add? I did have a question that came to me. You mentioned if a practice decides to go to the APM route, are you still able to work with us if a practice goes that route, since we will have to report ACI? Is your company still able to work with us? Would help a practice choose? Okay, so our work is done with your practice when you have scored a 3 and have completed phase 5. However, we continue to be available to you as it relates to the MIPS activities that will be necessary for you to address again by the end of this coming March. You should be well into identifying your activities and measures for 2018 MIPS requirements. However, once you actually join an alternative payment model, then you are out of the TCPI program. And that could be an ACO as well, if you're close to a, I mean in terms of working closely with a hospital where your practice works or admits patients. If you're asked to join a health systems ACO and you decide to do so, then we would not be able to continue working with you, because presumably we're helping you get ready to be in that kind of a organizational setup. And if you are, then we assume you're ready for it. I don't know, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but we can point you to where to find alternative payment models listed on the CMS website. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that there is one that's relevant to your type of practice or that is open for new enrollment. I think CMS is working on how to increase the number of alternative payment model options. Staying in MIPS is perfectly fine, especially if your performance on your quality measures is really high. If you're reporting, several measures, it'll be 6 required for 2018, and you're calculating a 100% rate or 0% if it's a negative type of measure, you'll score high in quality. So, you can decide to stay in the MIPS model if you think your performance is such that you're going to score very high compared to other practices. Ivan, did you have anything else you wanted to add about quality improvement structure and processes?
So as a question, yes, I would add, the people that work in practices are natural problem solvers. You give them something and they will jump right at it, find a solution, and put it in place quickly. I think the important thing to consider with these milestones that we've talked about is that, one, we want to make sure that there is a common structure that the staff is all aware of and a common language for how we do this. That becomes important over time. And so sharing with them again this webinar, some of the tools that you've learned about, the documents that we've shared, that'll help to get them on the same page and to create some common language. And then second, as I mentioned, is just to trust some of the problem solving with your staff. Give them some of these tools, some of the problems, and you will no doubt be impressed with what they come up with. And lots of times, in my experience, they come up with better solutions than me, the manager, or the clinicians oftentimes can come up with on our own. So empower them, trust them, and you will get the results that you are looking for.
Do any of you want to share anything about an improvement project you've done, or maybe just your experience with educating your staff? Okay, Sherry, do you have any closing comments?
No, I actually do not, but I had a question for you, Debbie. Was your response directed to Pam's comment question in the comment box, in the chat box?
Yes.
Okay, my audio cut off for a minute.
So yes.
Yeah, sorry.
I see Dr. Rich is also on the call. I don't know if he might have some. I'd like to give him the opportunity to comment if he's got anything he would like to add.
No, I think it's been a very fruitful discussion. A lot of great information. I would take it to heart. I think it's an important time for everybody to be looking at this very carefully and reassessing yourselves. And I think, as Debbie said, if you want to stay in MIPS, that's great. If you think you're going to outperform your peers, that's great as well. But just remember that your peers can often catch up to you in the MIPS world. So be careful when you take that approach.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Rich. So we are recording this, and we'll make it available for you to share with your staff if you think that will help. And we'll also remind you where you can find the initial recording we did that Ivan referred to. It's actually on the VCSQI website, and we'll point that out to you again as well. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to some more webinars such as today's that are going to focus on other milestones that we see practices are still trying to meet, or maybe even promoting and showcasing some that have done a great job of moving from 0 to 3. So have a great rest of the week and weekend, and we'll talk again soon.